We're starting this deep dive with a geopolitical earthquake that had an immediate and, frankly, a pretty bizarre financial ripple effect.
Hmm.
Earlier this month, January 2026, the capture of former Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro by U.S. Special Forces.
Hmm.
It just dominated the
It
headlines.
was a massive political trigger, absolutely. But the immediate financial consequence was, I think, the real stunner for a lot of people.
It really was.
Mm.
Because within days of that regime change, the U.S. completes its first public sale of Venezuelan crude oil, and it's valued at about $500 million.
Right.
And here is the paradox we have to solve for you today. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright stated publicly that the U.S. is getting about a 30% higher realized price for this oil.
Yeah, for the exact same barrel of oil that was worth much less just 3 weeks ago before Maduro's capture.
30% more. Think about that for a minute.
I mean, this is oil coming from a nation whose energy infrastructure has been starved, collapsing, and, sanctioned for years.
Yeah.
And yet, the moment those sanctions are lifted and the political risk is seemingly managed, this oil is suddenly commanding a huge premium.
Okay, let's unpack this then. How is the U.S. getting 30% more for oil from a nation whose energy sector has, plummeted to about 1/5 of its peak production?
It's a great question.
Our mission today is to figure out why this specific type of oil, Venezuela's dense, notorious crude, is suddenly so strategically valuable, and why the unique, almost forgotten design of U.S. refineries holds the whole secret.
It's a perfect storm. It really is. You've got a convergence of political certainty and immense technical need, and just the historical inertia of U.S. industrial infrastructure.
So what we're seeing is the true market value of political stability.
That's it. That's the price tag.
Let's nail down the immediate economic shift first, because that
Okay.
30% price premium, the number from Secretary Wright, it's a massive headline number.
Oh, it is. And that initial $500 million sale, it's really just testing the waters.
It's just the beginning.
Exactly. President Trump has already confirmed there's an initial tranche of, 30 million to 50 million barrels of this oil just sitting in storage. It was under sanctions, and now it's going to be released and sold immediately.
At prevailing market prices.
Yeah.
And the Department of Energy said these sales will continue indefinitely.
Indefinitely. And that cash flow is already being managed centrally. The president announced that he'll control the proceeds to make sure the funds benefit both the U.S. and, Venezuela's new leadership.
It's a huge, immediate infusion of capital into a very, very complex situation.
What's genuinely fascinating here, though, is the backdrop, the global market context.
Huh?
These sales are happening while global oil markets are actually dealing with a supply overhang. There's plenty of oil, which has kept prices pretty muted for the last year.
So normally you'd expect prices to go down, not up, when a major supplier suddenly comes back online.
Precisely. The expectation would be that prices soften, not that they suddenly jump by nearly a third for this specific oil.
Right, so the market isn't starving for any crude.
No.
It's starving for this specific type of crude. So if it's not about volume or global supply, we have to look at the oil itself. What exactly is a barrel of Venezuelan oil?
To answer that, we just have to touch on some oil classification basics. It's pretty simple. Crude oil is categorized in two main ways.
Okay.
First, by its viscosity or density. That's called its gravity, which tells you if it's heavy or light.
And the second?
And second is its sulfur content. That makes it either sour, which is high sulfur, or sweet, which is low sulfur.
And the general rule of thumb, which makes this whole story so weird, is that lighter and sweeter crude is what usually gets the highest price.
Always, because it's so much easier and cheaper to refine it into the good stuff, gasoline, jet fuel. Heavy, sour crude is the difficult, costly stuff to process.
The bottom of the barrel, so to speak.
Literally. And that difficult stuff is Venezuela's specialty. The nation holds the world's largest proven oil reserves. We're talking a staggering 303 billion barrels.
Wow.
But nearly all of it, located mostly in the massive Orinoco oil belt, is that heavy, sour crude.
And when our sources say heavy, they are not kidding. It's not like the oil you'd normally picture.
No, not at all. It's described as especially dense and viscous with a tar-like consistency.
Tar-like.
It's basically asphalt waiting to happen. You can't just pump it out of the ground easily. Extraction needs specialist methods, like injecting steam into the ground just to heat it up and make it flow.
And then you have to blend it, right?
Yes, you have to blend it with lighter oils, they're called diluents, just to get it thin enough to move through a pipeline.
So that immense technical challenge, plus years of political turmoil and underinvestment,
Yeah.
That's why their output has just crashed.
Completely. The decline is truly staggering. They peaked back in the 70s and 90s, producing around 3.5 million barrels per day.
And today?
Today, after decades of neglect, they're scraping by at maybe 800,000 to 860,000 barrels per day. It just shows you how dilapidated the infrastructure is.
It's a shadow of its former self.
It is. But even in that diminished state, that small amount of crude oil has just become the most sought-after feedstock in the U.S. market.
Which brings us right to the core of this 30% premium mystery. This is the U.S. refiners' moment.
Exactly.
This is where the story takes a really sharp, counterintuitive turn.
It's a massive infrastructure mismatch. So the U.S. is now the world's largest oil producer, right? Thanks to the shale boom in places like the Permian Basin.
And that's all light, sweet oil. The good stuff.
Tons of it. Domestic, light, sweet oil.
So if we're pumping all this beautiful, easy-to-refine, light crude at home, you would assume our massive U.S. refineries would be perfectly set up to process it.
That's the logical assumption.
Why bother with some dense, foreign, tar-like crude?
But the infrastructure is a relic of a different time. Nearly 70% of U.S. refining capacity was built and designed specifically to process heavier grades of crude.
Wait, say that again, 70%.
70. When the U.S. invested heavily in these complex refineries decades ago, light domestic crude wasn't the main game. So they built these facilities to handle the most complex, cheapest, heavy grades they could get on the international market.
Let me make sure I'm getting this right for you, the listener. We have an explosion of high-quality domestic light oil. But 2/3 of our own refining system is structurally dependent on heavy, low-quality foreign oil.
That's the engineering reality. It's completely counterintuitive, but it's a fact.
So where are these refineries?
The bulk of this heavy oil capacity is along the Gulf Coast, Texas and Louisiana. And these are not simple refineries. They're called complex refineries with deep conversion capabilities.
And they have these special components, right? Coker units.
Exactly, coker units.
And what do those do in simple terms?
They handle the nasty stuff. When you refine heavy crude, you're left with a lot of heavy, sticky, residual product.
The gunk at the bottom.
The gunk. Coker units take that gunk, and through a high-heat process, they crack it down into more usable, high-value products, more gasoline, more diesel, even something called petroleum coke.
And light, sweet crude doesn't produce that gunk.
Very little of it. So a refinery that's built around these expensive coker units needs that heavy feedstock to run at full capacity and maximize its profitability.
Okay, that makes it so much clearer. It's not a substitute for U.S. shale oil.
Not at all.
It's a perfect fit for a U.S. industrial machine that's been starving for its specific heavy feedstock.
Absolutely. Analysts are saying U.S. refineries would benefit tremendously from reliable access to this. For years, Canadian heavy crude coming down by pipeline, it filled that gap.
After the Venezuelan sanctions kicked in.
Right. But if the Venezuelan supply increases, it instantly becomes a massive competitive threat to that Canadian product.
Why is that?
Because the Venezuelan crude typically sells at a lower net price point to those specific Gulf Coast refiners. It's closer, it's easier to ship by sea, it's a better deal.
It's an instant competitive edge built on a historical engineering choice. And the company best positioned to capitalize right now.
Has to be Chevron.
Chevron. They're the only major U.S. oil producer that was already operating in Venezuela, right? Under a special sanctions exemption.
Yep. Which makes them the default frontrunner to profit immediately on any renewed production plans. They are positioned to be the first mover, benefiting from this immediate demand.
And that justifies the 30% premium we are seeing right now.
It's the whole story.
So the U.S. infrastructure is just screaming for this specific type of oil. The need is clearly there. But we have to temper this market excitement with the sheer physical and financial hurdle required to get Venezuela producing again.
Oh, the cost to fix decades of neglect it's astronomical. Rystad Energy estimates that to get Venezuelan output back to its late 2000s level, which was only 2 million barrels per day, still way below its peak.
Just to get back to 2 million.
Yeah. It would take about $110 billion in capital investment.
$110 billion. That's not just fixing a few leaks. That's rebuilding an entire nation's industrial capacity from the ground up.
And this is where the political confidence has to translate into genuine long-term security guarantees.
Right, because President Trump announced that U.S. oil company leaders from Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, Halliburton, they all met him and pledged to invest at least $100 billion to rebuild the sector.
A massive pledge. And it's supposedly backed by U.S. security guarantees. But the industry leaders themselves are not exactly jumping for joy.
There's a disconnect there.
The skepticism is palpable. Even Exxon CEO Darren Woods, who was in that meeting, he was very cautious. He publicly called Venezuela uninvestable in its current state
Uninvestable.
and said it requires significant changes before they can justify that kind of capital.
And who can blame him? You can't ignore the extreme historical risks baked into that country.
Not at all.
I mean, the reason companies like Exxon and ConocoPhillips left in the first place is because Venezuela, under prior leadership, just seized their assets back in 2007.
And that history isn't just a footnote, it's an active liability. Caracas still owes those companies billions with a B in outstanding arbitration claims from those seizures.
So you're being asked to pledge $100 billion in new money, while the old debts aren't even settled, in a country with a history of just taking your stuff.
It makes political assurances seem very thin. I mean, if the last regime just walked in and took the assets, what does a U.S. security guarantee really look like in practice? What stops it from happening again in 5 or 10 years?
That's the fundamental question.
It is. That's why experts like Baron Lamar emphasize that Venezuela's oil problem is fundamentally human and political. It's not technical. It's not commercial.
The capital needs certainty.
It needs ironclad certainty. So the money will remain cautious, incremental, and highly conditional until investors have real confidence in long-term political continuity.
So the 30% premium we're seeing right now, that's just the market price for removing sanctions and political risk on a tiny existing amount of oil.
Exactly. But scaling that up to 2 million barrels a day, that requires facing the existential risk of asset seizure and instability all over again. A vastly different financial calculation.
The need is immediate, but the trust has to be earned over a long time.
And historically, Venezuela has been a very, very untrustworthy partner.
Okay, let's bring this all back together for you, the listener. We started with the dramatic political shift, the capture of Maduro, and we've quickly uncovered 3 crucial interconnected takeaways.
First, that political shift immediately unlocked a huge price premium on existing oil. That first U.S. sale got about 30% higher prices, even in a soft global market.
Second, Venezuela's enormous reserves, all 303 billion barrels, are the difficult, heavy, sour type. And to get production back to even a modest 2 million barrels a day, the sector needs a staggering $110 billion in investment.
And third, the secret sauce that makes this heavy crude so valuable is that U.S. domestic infrastructure mismatch. This oil is a perfect competitive fit for nearly 70% of U.S. refining capacity.
Especially on the Gulf Coast, because those complex refineries need heavy feedstock to make a profit.
That's the key.
So the U.S. has solved the sanctions problem, and it has the technical structural need. But this raises an important question for you to think about as you watch this story unfold. Given the massive scale of capital required, that $100 billion plus, and the very recent history of the Venezuelan government seizing assets from these exact same companies, how much will the U.S. government need to guarantee or maybe even subsidize the security for this just to turn an uninvestable sector into a stable provider for its Gulf Coast refineries?
The market has the technical need and the strategic necessity to buy this oil, but the investment. It hinges entirely on whether the new political regime can genuinely provide the long-term confidence and legal security that was so violently stripped away in the past. That confidence has a price tag that might be even higher than the $100 billion they're asking investors to put up.